Pride and Prejudice contains one of the most cherished love stories in English literature, the courtship between Darcy and Elizabeth, surrounded by a much-loved cast of characters in this enchanting tale. Today, we continue a week-long Hangout on Air series, which sees us explore the world of Jane Austen, from Elizabeth Bennet, Mr. Darcy, film versions to zombie adaptations. I'd like to welcome back Jane Austen Society President and best-selling author of Happily Ever After, celebrating Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Susannah Fullerton, and award-winning British actress Miriam Margolyes. Today, we'll be talking about the incomparable writing style of Jane Austen. I want to welcome Miriam to read to us from the opening chapter, which illustrates the characters of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet so brilliantly, the wit and sharpness of the prose, and sets the tone so wonderfully for all that will follow.
Chapter 1. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighbourhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do you not want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. "Why, my dear, you must know. Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Moore immediately, that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week." "What is his name?" "Bingley." "Is he married or single?" "Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls!" "How so? How can it affect them?" "My dear Mr. Bennet," replied his wife, "how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them." "Is that his design in settling here?" "Design? Oh, nonsense! How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes." "I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, for as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party." "My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty." "In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of." "But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighbourhood." "It is more than I engage for, I assure you." "But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go merely on that account, for in general, you know, they visit no newcomers. Indeed, you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not." "You are over-scrupulous, surely. I dare say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my hearty consent to his marrying, whichever he chooses of the girls, though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzy." "I desire you will do no such thing. Lizzy is not a bit better than the others, and I'm sure she is not half so handsome as Jane, nor half so good-humoured as Lydia. But you're always giving her the preference. They have none of them much to recommend them, replied he. They're all silly and ignorant like other girls, but Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters. Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves. Oh, you mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least. Oh, you do not know what I suffer. But I hope you will get over it, and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighbourhood. It will be no use to us if 20 should come, since you will not visit them. Depend upon it, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humour, reserve, and caprice, that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and muse.
Oh, Miriam, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
It's such a great chapter.
Oh, it is, isn't it? Susannah, many people dismiss Austen's writing as, frivolous Regency romance, but her depth of wit and irony, as well as her fabulous characters, has seen a legion of fans continue to discover and love her novels. What are the great standouts of Austen's style in Pride and Prejudice?
Well, Jane Austen once famously commented, misquoting Sir Walter Scott, "I do not write for such dull elves as have not a great deal of ingenuity themselves." In other words, she's saying, I'm not writing novels for stupid people. I'm only writing for people who are intelligent enough to make out my prose, to work out my irony, to laugh at the funny things that I am giving them. So Jane Austen is not a writer for dummies. She really isn't. She's a writer for clever people. And so it takes a brain to appreciate the hallmarks, as you say, of her style. Now, I think those things are the wonderful sense of humour. We all laughed as Miriam was reading that opening chapter. That fabulous line about Mrs. Bennet's nerves. They are my old friends. So much of marital testing comes through in that line. There's, of course, the irony, and you get that so strongly in that very first sentence. It is a truth universally acknowledged. Well, what's a truth? What's universal? What's a good fortune? And who says the young man must be in want of a wife? The Mrs. Bennets of this world, or the young men themselves. There's so much irony in that wonderful first sentence. And then, of course, also illustrated by that chapter that Miriam read, is the brilliant use of dialogue. Jane Austen is a gift to filmmakers. They just lift huge chunks straight from the novel and put them on the screen because her dialogue is so crisp, so clever, so absolutely brilliant. So I think the humour, the irony, the brilliant use of dialogue, and the incredibly precise use of words. You never feel with Jane Austen that the editor should have gone through with a red pen. And much as I love Dickens, and I know Miriam shares that love of Dickens, you do occasionally feel with Dickens that the editor could have used a pen to some extent. Miriam may not agree with me, but with Jane Austen you just never feel that. Every word is there for a purpose. I think it's very interesting to reflect on what this novel might have been like in its very first form when Jane Austen originally wrote her novel First Impressions. Now, it's thought that possibly Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice were written in the epistolary form, in the form of letters from one character to another. There is a lot of reference to letters in Pride and Prejudice. In fact, 44 different letters are referred to or quoted from or discussed in the course of the novel. So what do you all think? Do you think maybe this novel might have once been written in the form of letters, or do you think it was written in the third-person narration that we know today? Michael, do you have any views on that?
Well, she may have done an earlier version that was epistolary. Epistolary? How do you pronounce that word? Epistolary. But it obviously changed. And why? How? What caused that change? What do you think?
I mean, I feel that you wouldn't have been able to really get the same characters if it had just been in that letter format, and the dialogue, that the back and forths, like we said, that first chapter is such a beautiful example of that. I think it would have been so lost within letters. That's just my feeling.
That's a good point, Natisha. It's a clumsy way of writing a novel. Many of the fashionable novels of Jane Austen's youth were written in that style. Samuel Richardson's Pamela and Clarissa are two very famous examples. But it is clumsy because you've got to separate characters in order to have them write a letter to each other. So you would have to make Jane and Elizabeth be apart so that Jane could then tell Elizabeth all sorts of different things. So it is clumsy, and if it was in that original form, I think Jane Austen probably just got fed up with it and thought, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to write my novel in a different style.
It's a difficult thing to do. I was just thinking of the Guernsey potato peel pie factory, whatever the title is, the mouthful. It was a reasonable success in trying to get the character, that's modern obviously, to get the character across. But I agree with Letitia. I'm so glad that it didn't keep in that style. I don't think it would have worked.
It is a kind of dialogue style, though. I mean, if you think, you know, there's not an awful lot of, I suppose, what you call narration in Pride and Prejudice. You know, a lot of the characters seem to be revealed through their dialogue and the way they talk and what they say or don't say or how they say it. Which, if you think of a story like, if you think of, let's say, Lady Susan, you know, you do get a very strong voice of the person who's writing the letter by using that. But it's really, as you said, restrictive in terms of, you know, yes. It's all reporting on the action. You don't get the characters sort of interacting either, and then all the ways that you make them stay separated for the length of the novel. It just, yeah, it's very clumsy.
Yeah. You raise a good. Oh, sorry, Terry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, but still, the letter. Whilst I agree with what everybody's saying, the letter is an important part of the novel because, one, it usually conveys something. So it conveys, you know, a message that, you know, that Mr. Collins is going to arrive, or that Lydia has, you know, has eloped. But also, too, just in the little nuances that Jane Austen uses. I mean, and the one, I won't go on, but the one where she quotes Mr. Bennet's telling the family about the letter that Mr. Collins has sent, and he's had it for a month. And he's had it for a month. It took him 2 weeks to respond. So just in that, it's like it tells you a lot about Mr. Bennet. So I just think the letters are like they're really important. I think she's just got the perfect sort of smattering of the various styles.
Jenny, you want to make a point?
Just going to connect with Terry there. What do you think of the important letter where Darcy explains his actions to Elizabeth? That's more than just a structural mechanical thing, that he may not have been able to speak that in person. What do you think?
It is a hugely important letter, isn't it? And in many ways, Mr. Darcy in that letter is speaking rather like Dr. Johnson. It's very almost ponderous prose. It's very formal. It's very structured. It reflects a lot of Mr. Darcy himself. And of course, it totally opens Elizabeth's eyes to her previous behaviour. She can now read the man as she starts to read the letter. So you're right, Jenny, it's a hugely important letter within the text. Just to return to Mr. Collins and his letters, did you know that the term a Mr. Collins letter is actually in the dictionary? Because his letters are so famous or infamous, a Mr. Collins letter is now the definition for an over-effusive letter of thanks. So Jane Austen has got Mr. Collins into the dictionary, and I'm sure he'd be very pleased to be there.
Lady de Bourgh would love that.
Wouldn't she? Michael, did you want to make a point?
I was going to mention the fact Marilyn Butler, who was an Austen scholar, brings up the point that the themes in an Austen novel are not common, are not unusual. They are common to the literature of her age. But we don't think much about the other literature of her age, even the other literature written by women. Although we do know about it now. She's the only one who's been consistently famous all throughout the last 200 years. So obviously in terms of style, there is something special about the way she manages those themes that were common to her age compared to the way that other authors, even other female authors, manage those themes. Does anyone else have anything to say about that?
Actually, Miriam sent me an incredible article today, and I'll post it on Google Plus after this. But and it was saying that an academic has digitally tracked the influence of writers and their works, and how other novelists or writers have taken parts of their style and adopted them in the way that they write. And it was in fact noted that Jane Austen was the most influential of those writers amongst a certain other group. But it was really interesting that she, set a tone, she set a style that has been used and continued on. So that was a great article, Miriam.
So she actually stood out in her day. She stood out in her day.
Miriam?
I've always thought of Jane Austen as having a very cool style. I don't mean cool in the modern sense, although of course she is cool in the modern sense, but there's a kind of a sort of educated detachment from her involvement in the characters. I feel she is completely in control, and that we follow her lead absolutely in her view and opinion of everybody. It's very clear what she thinks, but there's a clarity and a detachment, an objectivity in a way about her work. That it's pleasing intellectually, but I think that is what stops me from putting her below Charles Dickens. For me, he has a passion and indeed almost a pathology in his writing, and she is much cooler, and her style reflects that detachment.
Yes, I agree, Miriam. I think you're right, and the word cool is very appropriate. And certainly in comparison with Dickens, there's not the same huge energy or enthusiasm for a social cause, or perhaps also the same extremes of character. Dickens's characters tend to be much more extreme than Jane Austen's. They're sort of more bad or they're more good than Austen's are. So yes, I think Jane Austen holds herself back more. She's more reserved as a writer than Dickens is. And I don't think she drew on her autobiographical experience in the same way that Dickens did. So when Dickens was remembering the blacking factory and the horror of the ill treatment of children, he was writing so much from the heart that it pours out of him with great passion. Whereas Jane Austen doesn't have that same emotional involvement and that same autobiographical involvement.
Yet her characters are so much realer. I mean, I think that's one of the things I like about her novels, is that they're not, you know, they're not Evelinas, they're not these, or even some, you know, most of the female characters in Dickens. They're actually, all of the characters are actually people that you know or you have known or you're just about to meet. So they are very, very real characters and all wildly different. So they're not, okay, maybe Mrs. Bennet from time to time, but they're not all really exaggerated. They are people that you know and met, and you know that's I see it all the time. And you're always looking at people thinking, oh, that's a Mr. Collins, and just you know, it's real.
Do you feel that's because of I guess when I read Dickens and I adore Dickens, it's a different time and it's a different place and it's a different world that you enter. Whereas with Jane Austen and particularly Pride and Prejudice, there's a lot of themes that I still relate to, and it seems, you know,
very modern, isn't it?
Quite modern, exactly.
Very
modern. Whereas, so I think I relate in that sense to the characters, but I still, as Miriam says, I tend to fall in love and in deep passion with Dickens' work because he draws me in with such a different style and way of writing and yep, Miriam, please, you're the Dickens expert.
Well, no, not necessarily, but I would just say that I very much agree with you, because I think what Dickens does is he creates a Dickens world, which is not our world.
No.
Yeah.
But Jane Austen creates a world which is our world, which we can absolutely respond to. As you said, it has a contemporary force to it. And I think that is a big difference between them. I'll just finish that Dickens created his world out of his own trauma and passion and instability. That's why I call it a pathology. Whereas Jane Austen was extremely balanced, mature, sensible, civilized, absolutely the essence of civilization. But it is very much our world, and it's also the slightly narrow world of Jane Austen.
We are, of course, comparing two incredibly different and also incredibly wonderful writers. But one other difference I think that is very, very obvious in the style is Jane Austen's lack of description of places and how people look and houses and things like that. Dickens will give often descriptions that go on for some pages about the houses that his characters live in. Think of Little Dorrit and the wonderful description of Mrs. Clenham's house, which is almost falling down around everybody. Jane Austen only ever gives descriptions of a place, of a house, if she feels that it's got something to say about the character of the person who lives in it. And so, of course, we do get the description of Pemberley and how beautifully run it is and how wonderfully landscaped, and it really is almost a paradise, Pemberley. And in contrast, we get a short description of Rosings, where Lady Catherine de Bourgh lives, and that, of course, is over-showy. There are far too many mirrors. There's gilt everywhere. Lady Catherine wants to put on a display. So we get that difference as well, that Jane Austen has very little description. And even with the looks of her characters, we often don't know the colour of their hair or their eyes or how they're dressed. That is left to our imaginations. And perhaps that's one aspect of Austen's style not having dated so much, that a lot is left up to our imaginations when it comes to how the characters look and what the houses they live in are like.
Because it seems to
think
me that it's
Michael-
far more important to her what they're thinking, what they're feeling. So there's a lot more of the abstract, the pride and the prejudice and the truce, and so she's really far more concerned with the internal person and the internal descriptions of what's going on than necessarily the setting that they're placed in.
And compare that with someone like Georgette Heyer. You know, the degree of detail you get in a Heyer novel about the Regency period and you know, the clothes, the houses, and, you know, it is quite deliberately set in that period. So, you know, Austen, I mean, it is her own time, so she's writing a contemporary novel, but she kind of assumes that you know what it's going to be like, so she doesn't bother describing it.
Michael, you've got a point to make.
Are we all really plugging into a similar theme, which is that there are many more links between her age and our age than there are between Dickens' age and our age, or Bronte's age and our age? And her style allows us to see that and make those connections that we can't make with them.
I was going to say that I think so much comes down to her brilliant analysis or presentation of character traits and personalities that transcend time. And Diane's commented about it being, you know, quite modern, and the realism, and Terry's brought it in as well. They're just so believable, and you can meet a Mr. Collins or whoever, and that transcends all time. And how she does it, which has been described, you know, in things that Susannah's said and others have been saying, it works. I don't know if it's the link, it's just that she is absolutely brilliant in getting or showing an understanding of people and their real nature.
Well, she's talking about universal themes, isn't she? Love and awkwardness and and romance and things that still resonate with us today. Very different to, say, being in the poorhouse or you know, things that to us in our modern day world we tend not to have such a deep connection with, even though when we read these wonderful books we can you know, dive into these worlds and into these moments. So yeah, I think that's why Austen, I think, is still such a success. You see people watching, you know, Pride and Prejudice and reading it and going, yeah, that's exactly how it still is. I still get awkward when I see a boy, or I don't want to talk to him. He's arrogant and all those, you know, things. And rather than letters, we do it with emails and texts and things like that.
I think we can sum up Jane Austen's style by saying what has been said of Shakespeare. She wrote not for an age, but for all time. And I think people are really discovering that she is, well, I think, the greatest novelist of all time. And her huge legions of fans are certainly feeling that Jane Austen is as modern today in her style as she's ever been. So let's look forward to the next 200 years of Austen.
That's certainly a statement, and then a wonderful one to end this theme on. I'm sure that everyone's enjoyed this chat as much as I have, and I'd like to thank you all so much. That was really wonderful, and Miriam, again, that reading was just fantastic. Such a privilege to see you do that. Thank you so much. And tomorrow, I'm very excited to say, we will be back, and we'll be talking a bit more about the on-screen adaptations. There's been such wonderful and terrible adaptations, as well as great modern readings and adaptations on the screen. So please do join us, because it's going to be another wonderful talk amongst friends. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Letitia.